Why are we not talking about this book? Hey there, it's Mitzi. Welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to share my thoughts on Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Now, I struggled with how to title this, and I'm calling it the Dombey and Son book review, but I'm not a scholar. I am not some well-read person. I just love books and read them all the time. So when you think of a person that's well-read, you know, usually we think of some professor or somebody, you know. I'm just a normal person who enjoys reading books, and I happen to enjoy reading a lot of classic literature and vintage books, and I also happen to especially love Victorian literature. I just really enjoy that time period. Even when I read just historical fiction that's written today, if it's set in Victorian time, I want to read it because I'm really interested in that time period. So I don't want to come across as I'm giving you this formal review that you can take away and do a book report on or something, because that's not what I'm going to do. There aren't going to be spoilers in this either. I'm going to give you just a basic premise of this story and then my thoughts on some things about it. So I just want to get that out of the way up front, because this is just me as a regular reader who enjoys reading books and my experience with this particular book. So I read Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens starting in January, and I read it from January all the way through February. And there are, I think, 62 chapters in this particular novel. So Janelle from Too Fond of Books, she buddy read this one with me. So we decided we would start the year off with it. And since there were 62 chapters, we would read a chapter a day. And then at the end of February, kind of double up a little bit so that we'd finish in February. And that's what we did. So we read it through January and February, and it took us 2 months to read it. It was fantastic. I loved this book, and I do not understand why nobody is talking about it. You know, when I was in school, we were required to read Charles Dickens, and we were, you know, we read Christmas Carol, and I think the main one that most people read is Great Expectations, where I'm from, because it was a shorter one out of the, you know, Charles Dickens writes chunkers of books, and so that was a shorter book, and so we read Great Expectations when I was in school. And I remember enjoying Great Expectations in school. I don't think I enjoyed it as much as I would have if I would have just picked it up on my own, because, you know, when you are assigned a novel, it's just the whole mentality of, you're making me read this, so you don't enjoy it as much as if you would have just picked it up on your own. But I remember when I was in school reading Charles Dickens and enjoying the way he looked at the world. I thought his characters were interesting, and although I didn't quite understand everything, because I was I was only in high school and I hadn't read that much at that time, I did see something in Charles Dickens that I enjoyed. So fast forward to today. Over the past few years, I have been picking up Charles Dickens, and I have a goal to read all of his works. My husband has been kindly surprising me throughout the past few years with a new edition of this beautiful set of Charles Dickens, and now I have the complete set of Charles Dickens in this beautiful edition. And so I plan on just gradually making my way through them. And I find that the more I read him, the more I understand his way of writing, and the more I fall in love with his characters, the premise of his stories, and everything about the way he tells a story. I know that there are a lot of people that think, oh, he's too wordy, and he just, you know, he says something that can be told in a paragraph. It takes him, you know, several chapters to tell. And I understand what you mean by that, because when I first started reading Charles Dickens, I was like, okay, get on with it. But I will say that the more I read Charles Dickens, the more I pick up on certain things that I didn't pick up on before, where he needs to stretch out and say what he's trying to say in more words. Does he need to use all of those words? Probably not. Probably not. But it works for Charles Dickens. Okay, so I buddy read Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens in January and February with Janelle and Too Fond of Books, and we had such a great time reading this one. So this book is a long book. It is a longer one, and again, it has like, I think it's 62 chapters. My edition that I have here, which I have a beautiful hardcover, but I read in this one because I took notes, I highlighted and I underlined, and I didn't want to do that in my nice copy. But this copy has 948 pages, plus, you know, there's an appendix. I think there's a couple of other things at the end, but 948 pages of the story. So if that tells you anything about what kind of book it is, it's 62 chapters, 948 pages, and this book was published in 1848. I think his next book is David Copperfield, which is my all-time favorite book. So ever since I've read David Copperfield, it's been like at the top, all-time favorite. And I think he wrote this one right before he wrote David Copperfield. I might be wrong on that, but this book was published in 1848. So Dombey and Son is about Dombey, Paul Dombey, who his whole idea in life is to be wealthy, which he is wealthy, run his business, run his household like his business, to have a son, to leave everything to his son, and to train his son in the business to be just like him. That is all that this man wants in life. That is his greatest desire. His only desire is to have this company, Dombey and Son, to raise his son to be just like him, to continue this legacy, this business. So that's what this book is about, and that is the theme of this story. So there is a lot of industrial age type themes throughout the story. You'll see them obviously as you read it. Just like with any other Charles Dickens that I've read, there are lots of characters, and you do have to keep up with all the characters and what they're doing and where they're going, and they do get complicated, and his stories are complex. I will say there is a complexity to the way he tells a story, and there are always lots of characters. So when I was posting my review of this, I did see where someone had, I always look at, if it's a 5-star read for me, which this is, I always look at what the lower ratings are and why they say it. And so, you know, I looked at a 2-star or whatever, and they're like, this was a slog of a read. And I understand, maybe if it's the first Charles Dickens that you've read, I wouldn't recommend Dombey and Son being the first novel by Charles Dickens that you read. But I've read a few. I've got a few under my belt. And so when I started this, I didn't see it that way at all. I could not wait every day to pick up this book. These characters are fantastic. Yes, there are a lot of characters. The story is complex. There are many layers to this story, and you really have to pay attention. But I found it to be fantastic, and it was a fascinating read to me. All of those characters, he does have a lot of characters, but I find by the end, you realize the importance of all of those characters. And they all, if you'll just be patient, they all play a part in how it's tied up in the end. And I found that with every Charles Dickens I've read so far. There are these characters at the beginning, and you're trying to figure out why in the world they're there. And then as you go through, you may even forget about a couple of the characters. But by the end, you will see how they all tie together. And oftentimes what I love about Charles Dickens is, just like in this book, in Dombey and Son, some of those characters really surprise you. And they did in Dombey and Son. There were characters that were introduced in the beginning, and, you know, I paid attention because I know to do that now. But after, you know, I had made up my mind about certain characters, and then at the end, there were some surprises for me. And then it just kind of clicked and made sense of why he used those characters the way he did. So before I get on with the rest of what I want to say about Dombey and Son, be patient if you do try to read any Charles Dickens, but if you try to read Dombey and Son, please be patient and just let the story unfold. You have to take your time with Charles Dickens and just let the story unfold. But with this particular one, with Dombey and Son, from the very first chapter, I was hooked and thought, what is this? What is this going to be about? I was absolutely hooked. Because in the first chapter, well, I won't say in the first chapter because I want you to go in not knowing. So all I want you to know going into this story, I don't want to tell you too much. On the very first page, though, Dombey's son is born. That's all you need to know, because everything after that, to me, is too spoilery to even share with you, because I want you to experience like me. I didn't know anything going into this except that it was about a man and his son. And I'm glad, because as I read it, you know, if people would have told me certain things that happened early on in the story, it would have spoiled some of that curiosity at the beginning of it. So I'm not going to tell you anything except that on the first page, Dombey's son is born, and the story goes from there. And he has a son and he has a daughter named Florence. And that's all you need to know, I promise. So this is filled with wonderful characters and word pictures, as he does so well. I mentioned in my review of A Tale of Two Cities how I loved the story for the word pictures that he gave us as he told the story, because he is great at that. I'm learning now, after reading A Tale of Two Cities, which was the last one I read, now that I've read Dombey and Son, I'm seeing that more and more. And now I need to go back to some of these previous books I've read by Charles Dickens and see that too, because I'm sure I would. Because in this one, there are those same word pictures like I mentioned in my review of Tale of Two Cities. In this particular book, the ocean and ships is a huge word picture. The ocean itself, we had a lot of discussion. Janelle and I, as we were discussing this book throughout, we had a lot of discussion about the sea, the ocean, and what that meant in the story. And we were going back and forth as we read and the story unfolded. So the ocean, ships, those are big word pictures that I will always remember from the story. Another one that's funny is teeth, big white teeth. There is a particular character that's how this person's described. Every time he mentions this character, he talks about his teeth. And I had a nightmare about those teeth one night. I was so into this book, invested in it, that one night I started thinking about this particular character's teeth, and I woke up thinking about it, and it was like, okay, now I'm trying to figure out this part of the story. And I had kind of just made up my own story, blended in the dream with Dombey and Son, because I was so interested in the story that I would dream about it at night, and these teeth. So teeth. And then another word picture that to me really was effective was the church. There are scenes in this book where there is a church, and we have funerals, we have weddings, we have christenings, those type things that are going on in this church. And the way that Charles Dickens describes those scenes, I will never forget. When he goes back to that church and we have a christening, or we have a wedding, or we have a funeral, the way that he describes the church, the people, the way that they come and go from the church, it was brilliant. It was brilliant, and some of the best chapters in books I have ever read. Janelle and I talked a lot about that as well, because it was amazing. There are several chapters in Dombey and Son that are some of the best scenes, descriptions of scenes I have ever read in anything I've ever read before. I was amazed by it. So one of the things I would recommend doing is to find a paperback that you don't mind writing in, because there are so many references to certain things that you will notice as you go that you want to go back to, because Janelle and I were doing that a lot. There are descriptions of the characters in the story that you want to go back to, and so I was underlining, I was annotating, I was highlighting everything, tabbing, so that I could go back and discuss it with Janelle as we went along, and that made it even more fantastic, because by the end of the story you see why he has described the different things the way he's described it. And I'm not spoiling anything, because until you read it you won't even understand what I'm talking about. Until you get to the end you won't even know what I'm talking about, because there's so many different ways that as we were discussing it you could go with the story. So I highly recommend it. I thought it was a fantastic read. I know this isn't one of those formal reviews again, but I don't want to tell you too much about this book, except that I enjoyed it. I loved the characters. I felt like it was a complex story with many layers and many characters, but I felt like all the characters were important to the story and how the story was told. And that is all I want to tell you, so that I don't ruin anything and you can go in blind like I did. One of the things I do recommend though with any Charles Dickens is to buddy read it. They are longer and they do take more time, and you do have to be patient. You cannot rush through a Charles Dickens. The best way to read it is maybe read it a chapter a day, or a couple of chapters a day, and kind of marinate on it before you move on. And don't read it fast. By all means, take your time. And buddy reading is great for reading Charles Dickens. Now, I have read several Charles Dickens. This was the first time I had buddy read a Charles Dickens, and it was the best experience out of all of my reading because of Janelle and all that she had to say about the book as we went along. So I highly recommend Dombey and Son. I highly recommend buddy reading it to make that experience even more meaningful, and you can discuss it along the way. And one other tip I would give you is I also listened as I read. I found a great audiobook of this one and I listened, because as I have been reading Charles Dickens, I have noticed that he uses a lot of dialect, and sometimes in those chapters I would have to go back and reread them and try to figure out what he was trying to say, until I decided to start using audiobooks. Now, I do have to see it because it is difficult. It's not an easy read, but I find as I hear someone sort of acting it out as I'm reading it, I can understand that dialect better, because the way that he writes the word isn't the word. You know what I'm saying? It's the way the person's saying that word, or slang. So it's hard to understand if you're just reading that on the page what they're saying. But if you hear it, you know perfectly well what they're saying. It's like watching it, on television. So I do recommend an audio version of a Charles Dickens, buddy reading it, and taking your time just enjoying reading Charles Dickens for what he's so well known for, and that is his wonderful characters, all of his quirky characters, and the way that things play out on the page. So I do recommend Dombey and Son. For me, it was a 5-star read. Was it better than David Copperfield? I don't know. I don't know. Probably not. I still say David Copperfield is my favorite. But wow, this was a favorite too. And I'm sure that it's going to be. Right now, it's my favorite read of 2023. And I don't think it can be beat, but we'll see. So those are my thoughts on Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. I highly recommend it. Please read it if you haven't. I don't know why we don't talk about this one. We hear about Oliver Twist and Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. Of course, Christmas Carol. We hear about that one every Christmas. But until I joined BookTube, I had never even heard of Dombey and Son. So I am so thankful that I was able to read it with Janelle. Thank you, Janelle, for reading this with me. It was a fantastic adventure reading the story, and I will be reading this one again. So have you read Dombey and Son, or have you read any other Charles Dickens? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.